All right, so to wrap up this presentation on poverty here, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific consequences of poverty so we can really understand how living in poverty has negative effects on the lived experiences of individuals who are living below the poverty line. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about some potential solutions to poverty. And we're going to comparatively look at the United States against other industrialized nations in the US to really just get a better understanding about how significant of a problem this is, particularly in the United States today. So some consequences of poverty. Well, in comparison to wealthy people, or even just people that are living above the poverty line, right, which doesn't necessarily make you wealthy. Remember, you could live twice above the poverty line, so the poverty line times 2, and still be labeled as a low-income individual in the United States. But in general, people living in the poverty line experience more family problems. There are higher divorce rates for people of lower socioeconomic status, and there's also more domestic violence if you live in poverty. People living in poverty have worse health outcomes. There are higher infant mortality rates, which means babies that are born into poverty are more likely to die at infancy in comparison to babies that are born out of poverty. Earlier adulthood mortality rates, which means that you have a lower life expectancy if you're living in poverty. People living in poverty are also more likely to have mental health problems, specifically depression and anxiety. People living in poverty are also more likely to receive inadequate medical care. And this largely is a result of the fact that health insurance is not universal in the United States. So people who are living in poverty are far less likely to have health insurance in comparison to people that are not living in poverty. And when you don't have health insurance, obviously it can oftentimes prevent an individual from seeking medical care, even though they feel like they're sick or they need treatment for something because they simply can't afford to pay for it. People living in poverty receive inferior education in the United States, and we'll talk more about this in our next module when we discuss education. But if you live in poverty, if you live in a lower class neighborhood, you're more likely to attend a school that receives significantly less state and local funding. You're less likely to graduate high school if you live in poverty, and you're also significantly less likely to go to college if you live in poverty. And again, a lot of this has to do with structural disadvantages, and this will become more clear as we specifically talk about social inequalities in education in the next module. People living in poverty also have inadequate housing. You're more likely to be homeless if you live in poverty. Obviously, a direct connotation of living below the poverty line is that you are less likely to be able to afford rent. You're more likely to be evicted, as Dr. Desmond's research indicated, and so you're more likely to be homeless. You're less likely to own a home. People living in poverty are significantly more likely to be renting property rather than owning property, which means that they're not going to be able to accrue wealth in comparison to other people, which is definitely one of the factors you need to escalate out of poverty, is to accrue wealth, right? To own a car, own a home, etc., other than just having your only form of wealth being your monthly income. People living in poverty are also more likely to live in areas that lack resources, a number of resources. If you live in a poor neighborhood, you're less likely to have access to healthy foods. Many poor people live in what are referred to as food deserts, which means that the only access to foods they have are probably fast food restaurants or maybe local corner stores or convenience stores that only sell heavily processed foods. So they're less likely to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, foods high in fiber, whole grains, healthy proteins, etc., in comparison to rich people. And people who are living in poverty are also more likely to commit crime. Now, some of you may be immediately thinking, well, choosing to commit crime seems like a pretty individualistic choice. But of course, again, as a sociologist, remember, we're taking a step back and looking at things from this broader perspective. Committing crime often seems like the only choice many individuals living in poverty have simply in order to survive. And we'll discuss this in much more detail in just a week or so when we begin discussing the sociological problems affiliated with crime in the United States. So let's start talking in a more positive light about some solutions to poverty. So what can we specifically as individuals do to address poverty in our own communities, in our states, and most importantly, in our own nation? Well, like I've been saying since the beginning of this presentation, if we compare the United States to other nations and we look at our poverty levels, we should be feeling pretty ashamed, pretty embarrassed about what we're doing in the US. The United States, we have a reputation around the world of being a very ethnocentric nation. So what that means is that we tend to, in the United States, view our culture, view our values as being kind of superior to everyone else around the world. And this is obviously not a good quality for us to be kind of egomaniacs or self-centered in this regard. And not only does it make us less likable, it's actually really invalid if you look at data across almost every quality of life measure. The United States falls very short. And poverty is just one area that we have significant room for improvement. The United States currently has the highest poverty rate amongst wealthy nations throughout the world. Let that sink in. The United States has the highest poverty rate amongst wealthy nations throughout the entire world. All right, so this should be very alarming to us. This should be a strong indication that we're doing something wrong. And we're not just slightly above, right? We're pretty high above others. And this data, again, this graph is a little dated. We're currently at 12% poverty, which was put us about on board with Portugal and Spain. So this graph is a few years old when poverty rates were at its peak in the US, approaching 17, 18%. But still at 12%, about 12.5% where we're at now, we're still on board with being having the highest poverty rates around the world. So what are we doing wrong that other countries apparently are getting right? Right? There should be a clear indicator here that there are things that we could do in the United States to reduce our poverty. Look, countries like Denmark, Iceland, the Netherlands, their poverty rates are less than half of what ours is currently at. They're around 6%. We're currently at 12%. So what can we do to lower the poverty rates in our country? Well, a lot of research that has been conducted that has tried to address this claim largely attributes our individualistic mindsets in the United States, thinking that poverty is an individualistic problem rather than a social problem, as being the driving factor that impacts why our poverty rates are so high. So this particular study was conducted in 2006, and the authors quote, "Such countries often invest heavily in both universal benefits such as maternity leave, childcare, and medical care, and in promoting work among poor families. The United States, in comparison with other advanced nations, lacks national health insurance, provides less publicly supported housing, and spends less on job training and job creation. These other countries all take a more comprehensive government approach to combating poverty, and they assume that it is caused by economic and structural factors rather than bad behavior," right? I love this quote because this is such a sociological perspective here, right? These other countries, these other industrialized nations that have significantly lower poverty rates in comparison to the United States have more universal programs. They have more federal programs in place that serve to protect and provide essential resources like housing, like healthcare, like education to everyone in their society, regardless of socioeconomic status. So when people have to worry less about finding money to pay for these basic necessities because the government is paying for them, they can dedicate more of their time and energy and their money on simply providing for their families, providing food and clothing, etc. Right? So these other countries that have these federal programs in place, as it says in this last sentence here, they are taking a comprehensive government approach to combating poverty, and they assume it is caused by economic and structural factors rather than bad behavior. They're not blaming individuals for living in poverty. They're recognizing that there are certain structural factors. There are demographics, like being a person of color, being a woman, being a single parent, being a child, that are going to significantly impact your likelihood of living in poverty. So instead of blaming individuals, let's build some policies. Let's enact some policies and some structures in our society that help prevent individuals from living in poverty for extended periods of time. And if we did more of this in the United States, what this evidence strongly suggests, if we produce more universal programming that help pay for medical insurance, help pay for education, that help pay for housing for all people, especially those that are poor, we would have significantly lower poverty rates. All right. So what specifically can we do in the United States? What are some things that we as individuals can do? You might think, well, yeah, this all sounds great in theory, but as an individual, I can't control whether or not we have universal health care. I can't control whether or not we have free college education, right? So what are some individual actions that we can take? Well, first and foremost, we can all do our own part to participate in political protests and to elect political officials into office who really advocate for the poor. Now, regardless of what political party you identify with, I think we all have a social responsibility as citizens of the United States living in democracy where we actually get to cast our votes for individuals, especially at the local and state level where our votes have a really meaningful impact. We should do the work to invest the policies that our potential elected officials are supporting. If you see elected officials that are endorsing programs that extend protections to everyone in regards of, supporting measures like universal health care, universal education, etc., we should be maybe supporting those political officials, regardless of what their political ideology is, regardless of what party they identify. If we are individuals that care about supporting human equality and really care about eliminating poverty or at least lessening the number of people that live in poverty, these are things we need to take into consideration. And in upcoming weeks, when we talk about social problems particular to education and healthcare, we'll look at the statistics and the data that suggest how powerful supporting universal healthcare and universal education could be in the United States in terms of achieving equality. Another thing we can do, we can encourage local, state, and federal elected officials to support anti-poverty programs. You know how easy it is to reach out to your elected officials? Most people don't even know who their elected officials are. And that's a failure of our system in the United States. We don't do a good enough job teaching young people specifically how important it is to vote, how important it is to follow local and state politics, especially, to know how to contact your elected representatives and say, hey, there's this bill that's going up to Congress right now, and I really would like you to support it, and this is why. So learn more about your elected officials, learn more about certain bills that are being introduced to Congress, specifically those that could negative or have a positive impact on people living in poverty, and encourage your elected officials to support legislature that could achieve social equality across socioeconomic status. You could also support policies proven to minimize poverty in other nations. For example, raising minimum wage, providing universal health insurance, increasing Pell Grants, and financial aid for higher education have all been strategies that other countries have used that have significantly improved their poverty rates. So we could do more of this in the United States. And like I said, the first step is really getting yourself educated and informed about what other countries have done that has worked, specifically countries that have economies similar to the United States, and then encourage our elected officials to support these policies when they get introduced to by bills into Congress, so we can start improving social equality here. And lastly, we can use employment data to prove to our family and friends that it is inaccurate to think that poor people are lazy. Remember back when we talked about who poor people actually are in the United States, over 80% of the poor people in the US are either too young to work, too old to work, disabled, or looking for a job. A relatively small proportion of poor people in the United States are actually doing nothing with their lives, and even those people that aren't actively seeking jobs, that are living below the poverty line, the majority of them have children at home, they have aging or dependent parents at home, or they're full-time college students like many of you are. So it's really important to take a stand against these myths and to have those uncomfortable conversations with our friends and family. If you're driving with someone and they see a homeless person on the side of the street and they make a comment, saying like, oh, I can't believe how many people just ask for money and expect to get free handouts. That's an important opportunity for you to take a step up and to have that uncomfortable conversation and say, well, while I can understand why you might think that way, there's a lot of data that suggests that the majority of poor people, the majority of homeless people, can't get out of their situations because of these structural barriers that are in place. Those are opportunities for you to share your sociological imagination and your knowledge now as an up-and-coming sociologist with other people to help reduce the stigma towards poor people in the United States.